Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Whispers Beyond the Pines. The woods had been quiet when they arrived, peaceful in a way that felt almost too still. John, Sarah, and Mark had hiked for hours before reaching this secluded spot deep in the forest, so far off the beaten path, not even a map could show it. The trees stretched up toward the sky, the air was thick with the scent of pine, and the ground was soft underfoot. There was no one for miles, just them and the endless stretch of wilderness. They pitched their tents, unpacked their gear, and settled in, the setting sun casting long shadows across the clearing. Perfect, John said, throwing a log on the fire. Not a soul in sight. Sarah smiled, but there was something uneasy in her eyes. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though she couldn't say why. She pushed it aside, choosing instead to focus on the crackling fire and the familiar sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the wind rustling through the trees. Nature's lullaby. As the fire burned low, the moon rose high, casting an eerie glow over the woods. That was when it started. At first, it was faint, like a whisper on the wind. Sarah looked up, certain she had heard something, but there was nothing, just the trees standing silent and still. Her friends didn't seem to notice. She told herself it was nothing, probably just the wind or an animal moving through the woods. But then it came again, a voice, low, unclear, just beyond the trees. It sounded like her name, Sarah. She froze, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. Mark and John were talking, oblivious. She waited, her breath caught in her throat, listening. Nothing. She shook her head and tried to focus on the fire. She must be imagining it. It was just the night playing tricks on her. But then the voice came again, this time louder. Sarah. This time, it wasn't just her name. The voice sounded like it was coming from deep within the woods, from somewhere beyond the pines. She could feel it creeping closer, like it was reaching out, like it knew exactly where she was. Her heart started to race. Did you hear that? She asked, her voice shaking. John looked up, frowning. Hear what? I think someone's out there, she whispered, eyes darting toward the trees. Mark shook his head. Probably just an animal. Relax. But Sarah couldn't relax. The whispering had begun to grow louder, more insistent, as though the very air was vibrating with the words. It wasn't just her name now. It was a jumble of phrases, like someone was speaking directly into her mind, but she couldn't make out the words. Suddenly, there was a rustling in the bushes. All three of them turned toward it, breathless. But there was nothing there. Mark stood up, squinting into the darkness. All right, I'll go check it out, he said, trying to sound casual, though Sarah could hear the edge of fear in his voice. No, don't go, she protested, her voice rising in panic. But it was too late. Mark had already started toward the edge of the clearing, stepping into the trees. Mark, stop! Sarah called after him, but her voice was lost in the sudden rush of wind that whipped through the pines. The whispers swirled around her, like 100 voices pressing in on her mind. Sarah, Come closer. We know what you think." The air felt thick, heavy, and Sarah could barely breathe. She looked at John, who was frozen, staring into the woods, his face pale. Neither of them moved. They waited in silence, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Then came a scream. It wasn't Mark's voice, but a terrible, strangled sound that sent chills crawling up Sarah's spine. The scream echoed through the trees, a sound so raw and full of terror that it made her blood run cold. She bolted to her feet, the panic clawing at her chest. "Mark!" she cried, but no answer came, not even the whispering. It was as if everything had gone still. "We have to find him," John said, voice trembling. They both ran into the woods, calling Mark's name, but the deeper they went, the quieter the forest became. It was as if the trees themselves were swallowing their words. The further they went, the more oppressive the silence grew, until Sarah felt the very weight of the darkness pressing against her. Her heart pounded in her chest as the air turned thick and damp. And then they found him. Mark was lying on the ground, his body twisted in an unnatural position. His eyes were wide open, but they were empty, lifeless. His mouth hung open, but no sound came out. There was nothing but a blank stare that seemed to pierce into the depths of her soul. But the worst part wasn't Mark's lifeless body. It was the voices, the whispers. They were there, in the air, curling around her thoughts like vines. "Sarah, John, you're next. We know you." She froze, her blood turning to ice. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were repeating everything she had thought since they'd arrived. The anxiety, the worry, the doubt. They even repeated her fears, things she had never told anyone. The voices grew louder, closer, pressing in on her, as if the very air around them had become alive with their presence. John grabbed her arm, pulling her back, but the whispering wouldn't stop. It felt like the forest itself was alive, hungry, watching them. She could hear her thoughts, distorted, echoing around her like 1,000 voices in a twisted chorus. "Run," John gasped, his face pale, his eyes wild with terror. They ran. They ran until their legs burned and their breath caught in their throats. But the whispers didn't stop. They followed them, closer, louder, until it felt like the whole forest was closing in on them, like the trees themselves were alive, twisting around them. Finally, when they reached the clearing, the whispers ceased. The forest went silent. The wind died down. Sarah collapsed, panting, into the grass. What just happened?" she whispered, her voice trembling. John didn't answer. He was staring at the tree line, where the shadows stretched long and dark, as if the forest itself was watching them. And for the first time, Sarah felt it. That cold, gnawing fear, the sense that they hadn't escaped at all. The whispers were still there, somewhere just beyond the pines, and they weren't going away. Story 2. The Flickering Eyes. It was meant to be a simple weekend trip. A group of 4 friends, each eager to escape their city lives for a few days of hiking in the dense woods. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving only a hint of twilight. They had set off early that day, eager to make the most of the light. But when they stumbled upon the abandoned campsite, none of them expected it to change their lives forever. The fire pit was cold, the logs scattered carelessly around it. Old, tattered tents lay half collapsed, their fabric torn, but no one was around. No signs of a struggle, just an eerie quiet hanging in the air. The forest seemed unusually still. The rustle of leaves and chirping birds had faded into the background, replaced by a weighty silence. "Looks like someone left in a hurry," Matt said, kicking at a discarded sleeping bag, his voice breaking the quiet. The group, Matt, Jess, Chloe, and Ben, exchanged uneasy glances. They'd planned to camp at the edge of the forest, but this site seemed perfect, a little secluded but safe enough. No one was around, no other campers in sight. They'd set up their tents without much thought, dismissing the odd feeling that had settled in the pit of their stomachs. As dusk crept in, Ben pulled out the campfire kit. He lit the kindling with a quick flick of the match, the flames licking the air in a comforting warmth. They all gathered around, chatting to ease their nerves, but the growing darkness outside the fire's glow felt oppressive. Then they noticed it, a flicker of light in the distance, just beyond the trees. Jess squinted. "Is that someone else's fire?" she asked, pointing toward the movement. Matt, the most practical of the group, stood up, stretching. "Probably just someone else camping out here. I'll go check it out." "Are you sure?" Chloe asked, her voice a mix of concern and curiosity. "Maybe it's nothing. I'll be fine. Don't worry." Matt waved her off, stepping away from the firelight and into the gathering gloom. But as Matt moved further into the woods, the light became more distinct, more unsettling. It wasn't a campfire. It wasn't a flashlight either. It was eyes, glowing, flickering eyes in the trees. Red, yellow, in pairs, in clusters. Matt stopped in his tracks. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as a shiver of unease ran down his spine. The eyes were moving, slowly, watching. He turned back, his heart hammering. "Guys, something's not right," he called out, his voice tight with panic. The eyes shifted again, and then they began to move, darting from one tree to another, always staying just at the edge of his vision, always just out of reach. They followed him. Matt's breath quickened. "Matt," Jess called from the campfire, her voice quivering. He didn't answer. Then something horrifying happened. The eyes stopped flickering, and they began to move in unison. Hundreds of them. The forest was alive with them, rushing toward him like an avalanche. The flickering lights converged, and the air grew thick, charged with something ancient and wrong. Matt stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet. He looked up to see the eyes closing in, their hollow, dark pupils reflecting the glow of his own fear. But as he ran, the eyes followed, no longer at the edge of the woods, but just behind him, brushing the tops of his shoulders, brushing his skin. "Guys, help!" Matt screamed, his voice cracking. The others, Chloe, Jess, and Ben, rushed forward, panic gripping their hearts. They could hear Matt's frantic footsteps pounding against the forest floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But when they reached him, he wasn't alone. The eyes were there, surrounding him. They blinked in the dark like predators calculating. But these weren't animals. These weren't people. These were something older, something from the deep corners of the world that had no name, no form, only hunger. The friends froze. The eyes, now dozens then hundreds, closed in on them. The forest, once so peaceful, now felt suffocating. They were trapped, surrounded by something so ancient, so vast, that it wasn't just watching them. It was studying them, judging them. Matt screamed again, his voice high and desperate. But before they could move to help, something terrible happened. The eyes blinked out of existence. In an instant, the forest fell silent. The group stood frozen in the thick, suffocating darkness, heartbeats loud in their ears. A wind picked up suddenly, gusting through the trees, and with it, a low, guttural whisper, so faint, yet so clear. Not all who enter leave. Ben didn't wait to hear more. Without another word, he grabbed Matt's arm, pulling him to his feet. Run. We need to run. The group fled, but no matter how fast they ran, no matter how many trees they passed, the eyes never stopped. They followed, never blinking, always flickering, until the forest was all they could see, all they could feel. The land itself had become alive, hungry. Hours later, as the first light of dawn began to peek over the horizon, they emerged from the trees, breathless, terrified, and broken. They never looked back, and when they finally made it to the safety of the road, with the town lights shining in the distance, they realized something truly horrifying. The eyes, they weren't gone. They were still there, watching them, and they always would be. Story 3, The Mirror in the Woods. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a break from the chaos of school and work. Just a few college friends in the mountains, away from their usual routines. But as they hiked deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, and the forest seemed quieter than it should have been. The only sounds were the occasional crack of a branch beneath their boots and the distant call of birds. Everything felt off. By the time they set up camp, dusk had begun to settle in, and the trees stood like blackened silhouettes against the orange sky. They built a fire, lit some lanterns, and settled in, the crackling of the fire filling the silence. That's when they saw it. Tucked between two trees, half hidden by vines and moss, was an old mirror. At first, they thought it was just a trick of the light, the sun playing off the glass. But as they drew closer, they realized it wasn't just any mirror. It was huge, nearly 5 feet tall, and weathered. The edges were chipped, and the glass was cracked in several places, as if someone had taken a sledgehammer to it. But there was something strange about it. The reflection didn't seem to match the surroundings. "Is that?" Sarah whispered, squinting. "Is that our campsite?" It was, but not quite. The fire, the tents, the backpacks, they were all there. But the scene was twisted, like a painting gone wrong. The fire burned with an unnatural, greenish hue, and the tents sagged in places, as if someone had violently torn them. The shadows of the trees behind them were stretched, long and thin, like fingers reaching out from a nightmare. And there, in the background, was something else, shapes moving behind the wreckage of their campsite. "What the hell is that?" Jake muttered, stepping closer to the mirror. As he moved, the figures in the reflection seemed to move with him. At first, it was just a flicker, but then one of the shapes in the mirror, tall, gaunt, with unnaturally long limbs, took a step forward, then another. The others froze. The figure moved again, but this time it stepped out from behind the tin in the reflection and was now standing directly behind them in the mirror. Its face was obscured in shadow, but its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. It tilted its head as if it was studying them. "Guys, we need to go." Sarah's voice cracked, barely above a whisper, but no one moved. They were all staring at the reflection, their hearts pounding in their chests. "I'm not seeing this," Jake muttered. I'm not seeing this." Suddenly, the figure in the mirror jerked forward, and the others saw it. A flash of something white in the darkness. A face, twisted and pale, with wide, black eyes. The figure reached out with long, skeletal arms, and the fingers brushed against the edge of the mirror. The glass trembled. "Shit," Mark whispered. "It's not just a reflection." That's when they heard it. A soft scraping sound. At first, it was faint, like a nail running across glass. But then it grew louder, a horrible dragging sound. The figures in the reflection began to move closer, pressing against the mirror. Their bodies writhed like they were struggling to break free, their features becoming more defined with every passing second. Jake stepped back, his heart racing. "We need to get out of here. Now." But when they turned to leave, they found the forest had changed. The trees were closer. The path they had walked just moments ago was now blocked by thick, dark branches. The woods had grown silent, too silent. The air felt heavy, pressing down on them. "We're trapped," Mark said, his voice strained. The mirror seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The figures behind them were closer now, too close. They were no longer just in the reflection. They were part of the world around them. The shadowy limbs stretched toward the group, their fingers inching out, inching closer. "Run!" Sarah screamed, but the air seemed thick, heavy, as if the forest itself was holding them in place. The figures in the mirror weren't just reflections anymore. They were real, and they were coming for them. Panic set in. They turned and bolted into the woods, but the mirror's pull was strong. The trees, once familiar, now seemed to shift, their branches closing in around them like fingers. The sounds of footsteps behind them grew louder, more urgent. The figures were gaining on them. "Keep running," Jake shouted, his voice breaking. But it was no use. The forest was alive, and it was pushing them toward the mirror, toward the shadows that had once been confined to glass but now roamed free, hungry and waiting. By the time they reached the clearing, the mirror was gone. The trees were silent, but the memory of the reflection, the twisted, broken version of their campsite, the pale faces in the darkness, remained. They never spoke of it again. Story 4. The path that disappears. The day had been long, the kind of long that drags on until the sun starts to dip low, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The group of friends had spent hours hiking up the ridge, a mix of laughter and exhaustion hanging in the cool mountain air. By the time they decided to head back to camp, the light was already fading. Jake, the group's unofficial leader, spotted the narrow path through the trees, a shortcut he'd used many times before. "We can take this," he suggested, his voice a little too eager for the hike back. "It'll save us at least an hour." The others didn't hesitate. They were all tired, looking forward to campfires and the warmth of hot food. One by one, they stepped onto the well-worn trail, the crunch of fallen leaves beneath their boots the only sound in the quiet woods. But as they walked deeper into the path, something didn't feel right. At first, it was subtle. The trees seemed to stretch closer, the space between them narrowing. The ground, once even and stable, became uneven, roots creeping across the path like fingers reaching out of the earth. Sarah, always the sensitive one, slowed down and glanced over her shoulder. She frowned. "Didn't that tree look different when we passed it earlier?" she asked. Jake didn't answer, but his eyes flickered toward the same spot she had been looking at. The tree, an old gnarled pine, was still there, but the way it loomed now seemed off. Its branches seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if they were reaching out to them. But the moment passed, and they pushed forward, hoping the strange feeling would go away. It didn't. As they moved deeper into the woods, the air thickened with an unsettling quiet. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush, just an eerie, oppressive silence that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. Then it happened. The path began to shift beneath their feet. One moment, the trail was clear, crushed pine needles and smooth dirt. The next, the ground buckled underfoot, twisting like the earth itself was alive, trying to trap them. Emily gasped as her foot twisted, barely catching herself on a nearby tree trunk. "Did you feel that?" she asked, her voice shaky. "It's nothing," Jake replied, his tone more defensive than reassuring. "Just the uneven ground from the rain last night." But the path wasn't the same. They walked for what felt like hours, the dense trees blocking out the last light of the day. The sounds of the forest had gone completely still, and there was something about the air now. It was too thick, too heavy. When they reached a small clearing, the group stopped. They looked around, expecting to see the familiar markers of their original path. The campsite was just a short distance away, or so they thought, but the path was gone. The trees had closed in, surrounding them in a thick, dark ring. The trail they had followed was nowhere to be seen. Just more trees, more shadows. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore," said Mark, his voice wavering. "We need to head back. Now." They turned around, thinking maybe they'd made a wrong turn somewhere. But when they did, they were met with the same view. Nothing but more trees. The path behind them was gone, swallowed up by the forest like it had never existed. "Guys, this isn't right," Sarah whispered. Her eyes were wide with fear now, her hands trembling as she gripped her pack. "The path, it's gone. It's like we're stuck." Jake swallowed, trying to remain calm. "Let's just keep walking. We'll find our way out. It's just a loop or something." They walked for what felt like hours. But no matter which way they turned, they were always facing the same trees, the same shadows. The path, if there ever was one, was gone. The forest had become a labyrinth, closing in around them. Panic began to settle in. Their breaths grew shallow, and their steps became erratic. The woods seemed to be shifting like a living thing, pushing them deeper and deeper into its tangled core. Emily's voice cracked, breaking the silence. "I swear, "We're not going anywhere. We're just going in circles." "Keep moving," Jake urged. But even his voice lacked confidence now. He could feel it, the same thing the others felt. The forest wasn't just confusing them, it was trapping them. The trees seemed to close in tighter, and for the first time, they felt the forest watching them. The space between the trees stretched longer, the shadows growing darker, like the woods themselves were alive and aware of their presence. The ground began to tremble underfoot, subtle at first, but growing stronger with every step. The trees around them seemed to lean closer, their twisted branches reaching down like claws. "I think it's trying to keep us here," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think the forest doesn't want us to leave." It was true. As they turned in every direction, the woods swallowed them whole. The trees seemed to shift again, closer this time, until the whole forest seemed to be pulsing with something ancient and hungry. No matter how far they walked, they never got closer to the camp. Then they heard it, a distant sound, like a low growl, vibrating in the air, almost felt more than heard. The earth beneath their feet seemed to groan, as if the forest itself was preparing to devour them whole. "I don't think we're getting out," Jake whispered, his voice full of dread. The panic finally took over. They scattered, each of them running in different directions, but it didn't matter. The forest moved with them, the trees twisting and turning like they were trying to grab them. No matter how hard they ran, they couldn't escape. By the time the sun came up the next morning, the forest was still there, alive and watching. But the group was gone, vanished, swallowed by the ever-shifting shadows of the woods. And the path, it was still gone, as if it had never existed. Only the trees knew the truth. The path had never been theirs to find. Story 5. The Watcher in the Creek. The campsite was nestled at the base of Eagle's Peak, a place renowned for its untouched beauty and rugged tranquility. The evening sun dipped behind the jagged mountain, casting long shadows over the valley as the group of friends, 4 college students looking for a weekend escape, settled by a crystal-clear creek that gurgled softly in the fading light. They pitched their tents with laughter and camaraderie, setting up the campfire in its usual circle. But something in the air felt different, like the earth itself was holding its breath. As the fire crackled and the night grew darker, the friends gathered around, the warmth of the fire casting flickering shadows on their faces. There was something hypnotic about the rhythmic sound of the creek, the way it tumbled over smooth rocks and whispered through the trees. Everything seemed peaceful, even serene, until the splashing started. At first, it was soft, almost imperceptible, the sound of something wading through the creek, just beyond the firelight. They all paused, staring at the dark water, half expecting to see a deer, or perhaps a stray raccoon, stepping delicately into the stream. But there was nothing. The water remained still. "Probably just a fish," Jake said, trying to brush it off with a casual shrug. He tossed a few more logs onto the fire, sending sparks into the night sky. But then it came again, this time louder, more deliberate. A soft splashing, like the heavy footfalls of something moving in the water, but deeper, like something submerged, its movements slow and methodical. "What the hell?" Emily whispered, her voice tight with unease. She peered into the creek, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but the water remained still. "I don't see anything," Josh said, standing up and walking toward the edge of the creek. The beam of his flashlight sliced through the murky water, illuminating nothing but the rippling surface. "Maybe it's just a beaver," Sarah suggested, but her voice trembled. She hugged her knees to her chest, her eyes flicking nervously toward the water. The splashing continued, a slow, steady rhythm that seemed to grow louder with each passing moment. Jake stood up and grabbed a stick, prodding the ground nervously. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, a sensation he couldn't shake. "Hey, maybe we should check this out," Josh said, stepping cautiously closer to the creek. "See what's making that noise?" Jake nodded, though a knot of unease twisted in his stomach. They had all heard it by now. The sound was unmistakable, and it wasn't coming from the surface of the creek. The splashing wasn't on top of the water. It was coming from beneath. The ripples on the surface were subtle but distinct, as though something large was moving underneath. The group gathered at the edge of the creek, the beams of their flashlights dancing over the water's surface. As they watched, the splashing grew louder, closer. The surface of the creek rippled again, undulating in a slow, methodical way that had nothing to do with the current. It was then they saw it. At first, it was a shadow just beneath the surface, but then it grew clearer, a long, serpentine shape, coiling and twisting just under the water, like something ancient and unfathomable, something massive. The water swelled as the shape moved closer, just inches beneath the surface. They all stood frozen as the thing, whatever it was, drew closer and closer to the shore. And then it stopped. The water went still. "Guys, that thing's not a fish," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. For a moment, everything was eerily silent. The wind stopped, the creaking of trees hushed, and in that silence, they heard something else, a low, guttural sound. Not a growl, not a hiss, but a sound that resonated deep in their bones. It came from beneath the water, a sound that seemed to pulse with a rhythm of its own. The ripples began again, this time more violent, more frantic, as though whatever was under the water had noticed them, had realized they were watching. Jake's breath hitched in his chest, and he took a step back. "Maybe we should leave," Emily said, her voice shaky. Her eyes were wide, staring at the dark water. "Something's not right here." But it was too late. The surface of the creek suddenly exploded in a surge of water, as if something had burst from the depths with all the force of the storm. It was too fast to see clearly, just a blur of shadow and scales, moving in a blur beneath the moonlight. The air seemed to grow colder, heavier, as the water churned and splashed violently. "Run!" Josh shouted, his voice laced with terror. They turned and bolted toward the camp, the sounds of the water's fury echoing behind them. But as they ran, they could hear it. Something was following them. The splashing was back, growing louder and louder, as if whatever was beneath the creek was chasing them. They made it back to the campfire, their hearts pounding in their chests. But the fire, once bright and warm, flickered weakly in the growing cold, as though it too was afraid. The splashing stopped. For a long moment, everything was silent. No one moved, no one spoke. The darkness around them felt heavy, pressing in from all sides. Then, from the shadows at the edge of the creek, they saw it. A pair of eyes, glowing faintly, watching them. And then, slowly, the ripples began again. The thing was waiting, patient, watching. It had been there long before they arrived, and it would be there long after they left. Story 6. The Silent Forest. A group of friends, Cameron, Lily, Ben, and Sarah, had heard the stories, but they didn't believe them. Not really. The Silent Forest, they called it. A secluded patch of wilderness hidden deep in the mountains, known for its strange reputation. People claimed it was home to an eerie stillness, an unnatural silence that made it feel wrong. But to Cameron, Lily, Ben, and Sarah, it was just another place to escape for the weekend, a perfect spot for a camping trip. They set up camp near the heart of the forest, a small clearing with a few weathered trees standing like silent sentinels around them. The air was thick, heavy with an almost oppressive stillness. No birds, no rustling of leaves, no hum of insects. It felt like the forest had been emptied, like nature itself had gone mute. "I don't know," Lily said, looking around nervously. "It's too quiet." "Oh, come on," Cameron laughed, tossing his backpack to the ground. "You're just spooked by the stories. We're fine. It's just a forest, right?" But Lily wasn't so sure. She could feel the tension in the air, an intangible weight pressing down on her chest. She had read the same stories, the tales of hikers who'd vanished without a trace, the whispers of strange things moving in the dark. But she never thought she'd experience it firsthand. As night fell and the fire crackled to life, their unease began to melt into a false sense of security. The warmth of the flames made the shadows around them seem more like friendly silhouettes than threats. They sat around the fire, laughing, joking, and telling stories, anything to break the tension. But even as the jokes flowed, there was something unsettling about the way the darkness pressed in around them. Then, the silence broke. It started slowly, just a soft tap. At first, they thought it was the sound of a branch falling or an animal stirring. But it wasn't that. The tapping grew rhythmic, deliberate, like someone or something was tapping on a tree. Tap, tap, tap. The sound came from all directions at once, but when they turned to look, there was nothing there. "It's probably just an animal," Ben said, though his voice sounded strained, as if even he didn't believe it. But the tapping didn't stop. It grew louder, faster, and more intense. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded like a drumbeat, steady and unrelenting. "We need to get inside the tents," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. But no one moved. They couldn't. The tapping seemed to be coming from all around them, as though the forest itself was closing in, tightening its grip. The trees were no longer just silent observers. They were alive, watching them, listening, waiting. Lily shivered. She could feel something, a presence, something ancient, like the very earth beneath them was alive, a hungry thing, watching them through unseen eyes. The tapping wasn't random. It was a pattern, a warning, or a countdown. They were being circled, hunted. "Where's the wind?" Cameron asked suddenly, his voice trembling. "Where's the breeze?" "There's nothing. It's too still." The forest felt like it was holding its breath, as if the world itself had paused, waiting for something. But whatever it was closer now. The rhythmic tapping grew louder, faster, and then it stopped dead silent. For a moment, they all just stared at one another, wide-eyed, hearts pounding in their chests. And then, in the stillness, they heard it, a low, rumbling growl, somewhere deep within the forest. It wasn't the growl of an animal. It was deeper, older, like the sound of the earth itself cracking open. Sarah was the first to break the silence. "We need to leave. Now." But they couldn't. As soon as they started to gather their things, the growling grew louder, closer. It wasn't just the trees watching anymore. The forest itself seemed to be moving, shifting. They could hear the whispers in the wind now, but the words weren't clear. They were ancient words, things from a time before time, things too old for their minds to comprehend. The fire flickered and sputtered. The tapping returned, closer now, right behind them. Tap, tap, tap. And with each sound, the air grew colder. The trees seemed to bend closer, their limbs reaching, groaning as if they were waking from some long slumber. "Get to the tents," Ben shouted, his voice cracking with panic. But even as they scrambled toward the shelter of their tents, the ground beneath their feet began to shift. The earth trembled slightly, like it was trying to swallow them whole. The tapping stopped. For a moment, everything was still again, but the silence felt different. It wasn't a calm stillness anymore. It was the kind of silence that hung heavy in the air, like it was waiting for something terrible to happen. And then a voice whispered from the darkness, a voice that wasn't quite human, something ancient and hungry. "You are not alone." The wind howled, the trees shook, and in that instant, the ground beneath them split open, revealing a darkness deeper than the night itself. The presence that had circled them was no longer a distant thing. It was here, in the clearing, its hunger reaching for them. And no matter how fast they ran, no matter how far they went, they would never escape the forest. It had been waiting for them, and it would never let them leave. The silent forest had claimed them, and no one would ever hear their screams. Story 7. The Visitor in the Tent. The weekend had started like any other camping trip. Excited college friends packing their gear into the back of an old, rusted van, laughing and joking about how they'd make the most of the weekend away from the chaos of campus life. The secluded meadow they found was perfect, the air crisp with the smell of pine and earth, the sky stretching out, unbroken, above them. They set up camp, the tents pitched in a rough circle, a campfire crackling in the middle. There was a sense of freedom in the air, a carefree kind of peace that made them forget the world beyond the trees. By the time the stars were out, the laughter had died down, replaced by quiet conversation and the soft crackling of the fire. The glow from the flames flickered across their faces, casting long shadows on the forest's edge. They hadn't expected to see anyone else this far off the beaten path, and they liked it that way. Just the 6 of them and the wilderness. "I'm heading to bed," Jenny, the most practical of the group, said with a yawn as she rose from her seat near the fire. "We're hiking early tomorrow." The others nodded, already half asleep, each retreating to their tents, tired from the long drive and the day's hike. Inside her tent, Jenny crawled into her sleeping bag, pulling the zipper closed, the chill of the night air nipping at her cheeks. She could hear the rustling of the others as they settled in too, the distant hoot of an owl, the whisper of the wind moving through the trees. Then a soft knock echoed through the still night. At first, Jenny thought it was just the wind, a branch tapping against her tent, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. She froze, holding her breath. It came again, slower this time, like someone trying to get her attention. Her mind raced. An animal? A raccoon? A deer brushing up against the tent? She glanced over at the entrance, her eyes straining in the dark. She tried to dismiss it, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent. The knocking echoed in her head. Knock, knock, knock. She couldn't stand it anymore. Slipping out of her sleeping bag, she unzipped the door, stepping out into the cold night. The others were still in their tents, their own zippers zipped shut, no sound coming from their sides of the camp. Jenny looked around, her breath clouding in the night air, her heart pounding in her chest. Nothing. There was no one out there. No raccoon, no wind, no reason for the noise. Confused, she climbed back into her tent and zipped it shut, trying to brush it off. Maybe it had been a dream, but before she could settle in again, it came once more. Knock, knock, knock. Closer this time. Jenny's heart skipped a beat. She looked to the side of her tent, where the knocking seemed to be coming from. Her breath caught. Was it the sound of someone at the flap? Her pulse quickened, and she felt a sudden cold sweat creep across her skin. She climbed out again, hesitated at the opening, then called into the darkness. Hello? Is someone there? There was no answer, only silence. Her stomach twisted with unease. This wasn't right. This wasn't normal. She stood there for a few moments, listening, but there was nothing, just the rustling leaves and the sound of her own breathing. Her mind fought to make sense of it all, but she couldn't. Then she turned around, back toward her tent. The world seemed impossibly quiet, until she heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. This time it was unmistakable. The sound came from inside her tent. She froze, every muscle in her body seizing with fear. There was no mistaking it now. The knocking wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from within. She backed away slowly, but the knocking continued, louder, more urgent. It wasn't just knocking. It was as if something was trying to get out. Her hands shook as she reached for the zipper. She pulled it open with a trembling hand, her heart thundering in her chest. The knocking didn't stop. It kept pounding in her head as she pushed the flap aside. The inside of the tent was just as she had left it, empty. Her sleeping bag lay untouched. Her gear sat in the corner, undisturbed. But as her eyes scanned the tent, something caught her attention. The walls of the tent were moving. The fabric was pulsing, like something pressing against it from the inside. Something was behind it, and that's when she heard it, whispering, low at first, a breathy murmur that sounded almost like a voice. It was coming from the far corner of the tent, the shadowed space where her gear was piled up. Jenny's breath caught in her throat. The voice sounded familiar. Jenny, her heart froze. It sounded like her name, her own voice but twisted somehow, like an echo. The sound of the knocking filled her ears again, and the whispering grew louder. Jenny. Her feet froze to the ground. She couldn't move, couldn't think. A cold wave of terror washed over her, suffocating, paralyzing. And then, as her eyes moved back to the corner of the tent, she saw it. There, just beyond the fabric, a shape, a figure, one that wasn't supposed to be there. A face, her face, pressed against the fabric, staring at her with wide, empty eyes. The figure smiled. Jenny's scream was swallowed by the night as the darkness rushed in. The next morning, the others woke to find Jenny's tent empty. Her gear was still inside, her sleeping bag undisturbed. They searched the woods for hours, calling her name, but she was never found. And though the others left the meadow and tried to forget, some nights, when the wind blows just right, they can still hear the soft knock, knock, knock echoing in the trees. Story 8. The Haunting of Black Oak Ridge. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth as 5 friends made their way to the base of Black Oak Ridge. They'd heard the stories before, the old ones about the missing hikers, the strange lights that flickered on foggy nights, and the ghostly figures seen walking the ridgelines when the moon was just right. But they were here for adventure, not superstition. They shrugged off the warnings and set up camp near the edge of the ridge, surrounded by towering oaks that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. By the time night fell, the fire was crackling merrily, casting flickering shadows across the group's faces. The laughter of the day slowly faded into quiet conversation, the only sounds coming from the occasional snap of twigs in the distance and the steady rhythm of the wind rustling the leaves. But then, something changed. A thick fog rolled in. First, a soft haze, then a dense, suffocating blanket that swallowed everything. The campfire flickered, casting weak, uncertain light that barely pierced the mist. As the group huddled together, trying to keep warm, they heard it, soft, rhythmic steps in the fog, the sound of footsteps that weren't their own. "What is that?" Sarah whispered, clutching the flashlight she had in her hand. Her voice was tight with fear, but she didn't know what to be afraid of yet. "I don't know," Mark replied, but his voice trembled as he looked into the thickening fog. Maybe it's just an animal, but no animal would make those footsteps. Suddenly, a shadow passed in front of them, too tall to be a deer, too wide to be anything else they could recognize. It moved through the mist like a living thing, its edges blurred and shifting as if it wasn't quite real. "Did you see that?" Dave gasped, his eyes wide, his hand shaking as he pointed into the fog. They all turned to look. In the distance, another shadow appeared, and then another. Slowly, they started to form shapes, figures, almost human, drifting in and out of the mist. At first, they seemed like just shadows, dark and formless, but then they began to take shape. Faces, gaunt and pale, appeared briefly in the fog, their eyes hollow and staring. And then the figures stepped forward. There was no sound of their feet on the ground, no crunching of leaves or twigs beneath them. They simply moved, fluid and unnatural, gliding through the mist like they didn't belong to the world of the living. "These are the ones," Sarah whispered in horror, her voice trembling as she clutched her jacket tighter around her. "The missing people from the stories." The figures began to move closer, slow but sure, their limbs twisting in ways that didn't seem right. They were people, but not. The skin was pulled tight across their bones, their faces distorted into something unnatural, something hungry. The air around them grew colder, and with it, the fog thickened, swirling as if it had a mind of its own. "I don't think they're just lost," Mark said, his voice low and full of dread. "I think they're waiting for something." A whisper floated through the mist. It wasn't clear at first, but then it grew louder, a voice calling out a name. Not one of theirs, but someone from far off, a name lost to time. "You hear that?" Dave asked, his voice quaking. Before anyone could answer, the shadows drew closer. They could feel the coldness of them now, seeping into their bones, and the fog began to close in on them. The figures moved in a circle around the campers, getting closer, their eyes glowing faintly as they reached out with their twisted hands, as if trying to touch the living. "They're not real," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're just ghosts. They can't hurt us. They can't." But even as she spoke, one of the figures reached out for her. Its skeletal hand brushed against her cheek, and she screamed, pulling away in terror. The figure grinned, if you could call it a grin, its mouth splitting into something unnatural, and the coldness around them intensified. The group tried to run, but the fog closed in around them, wrapping them up in an impenetrable veil. Every direction they turned, there were more shadows moving toward them. They were trapped. There was no escape. "Stay together," Mark shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "We have to survive until dawn. Just stay together." But as they ran, the figures seemed to grow stronger, more solid. They could hear the whispering again, this time clearer, calling their names, each voice familiar, yet twisted. Each one an echo of someone they knew, someone they loved. And then the figures began to laugh, low, hollow laughs that echoed through the fog, rattling their nerves. They couldn't outrun the fog. They couldn't escape the figures. The night stretched on, every second like an eternity, every step a struggle against the unseen forces pulling them deeper into the mist. And then, just as the first rays of dawn broke through the fog, the figures vanished. The forest fell still. The shadows melted into the mist, leaving nothing behind but the soft rustling of the wind in the trees. But as the group made their way back to their camp, shaken and breathless, they realized that not all of them had survived the night. They were missing one, Sarah. When they returned to the campfire, her flashlight lay on the ground, still flickering weakly in the cold, empty space. And in the distance, the fog slowly began to roll in again. Story 9. The Bone Tree. It had been a typical camping trip. A few friends, a weekend escape into the wilderness, a few beers by the fire, and the usual banter. But everything changed when they ventured deeper into the forest. The path had faded, and the trees became denser, the shadows darker. What was supposed to be a short detour to explore something new had taken them farther than they realized. It was Ethan who spotted it first. The tree, at first, It didn't seem unusual, just another massive oak, towering over the others, its roots gnarled and sprawling. But as they approached, it became clear that this wasn't like any tree they'd ever seen. The bark was covered in symbols, carved, ancient, almost glowing faintly in the low light of the setting sun. The roots, twisted and winding, seemed to crawl along the ground as though alive. But what truly stopped them was what hung from its branches' bones. There were dozens of them, human and animal alike, some too bleached by time to tell what they once belonged to. Some were shackled together, others dangling loosely, as if they were trophies or warnings. But something in the air felt wrong, a strange energy surrounding the tree that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. This is unreal, Mia said, her voice trembling. What do you think it means? Ethan stepped forward, drawn to the tree as if it called to him. I don't know, but it's got to be some sort of ritual. Maybe someone else came out here before us. His voice had an edge of excitement, mixed with unease. He reached out, his hand brushing against the rough bark. The moment his fingers made contact, something happened. A soft rattle echoed through the air. The bones in the branches stirred. Ethan jerked his hand back, eyes wide with surprise. The rattling grew louder, the bones shifting as though they were alive. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees, but it didn't feel like wind anymore. It felt alive, watching them. What the hell? Tyler whispered, his voice barely audible as he backed away. But it was too late. A low murmur began, quiet at first, like a whisper on the breeze. The words were unintelligible, just strange sounds that seemed to wrap around them, curling into their ears like fingers. And then, one word broke through the haze. You've disturbed us. The forest fell unnervingly still. At first, they thought it was just their minds playing tricks, the pressure of being so deep in the wilderness messing with their perception. But the voices grew louder, sharper, more distinct. And now they could hear more than just the whispers. They could hear what sounded like laughter, twisted, guttural laughter. Get back, Mia shouted, pulling at Tyler's arm, but it was too late. The ground beneath their feet began to shift. They could feel it, roots crawling under the soil like serpents. The trees creaked, their branches bending unnaturally toward them, as if drawn to the scent of their fear. I don't know what's happening. Tyler gasped, panic rising in his throat. The tree's roots began to twist upward, breaking through the earth. They could hear them now, snapping like bones as they moved, coming toward them, searching. In a panic, the group stumbled backward, but the forest closed in faster than they could react. The whispers grew louder, the laughter darker, and then they heard another voice, low, ancient, commanding. Leave now. The trees seemed to stretch, their limbs reaching for the sky, blocking out the remaining light of the day. Shadows moved like living things between the trunks, too fast, too fleeting to catch. And as they turned to run, the ground began to tremble beneath their feet. It was Ethan who saw it first, shadows rising from the roots of the tree, writhing and twisting, taking shape. Figures made entirely of bone, walking toward them with an eerie, unnatural gait. Their faces, Human faces were contorted in agony, their eyes empty, their mouths twisted into grimaces of pain. "Run! Run!" Ethan shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the growing roar of the forest. The roots lashed out like whips, cracking the ground around them. They ran, blinded by terror, their legs burning, heart pounding, the dark shapes chasing them through the trees. Every step they took felt heavier, as if the earth itself were trying to swallow them whole. The whispers still followed, echoing in their ears, growing more frantic. "You've disturbed us. You'll never leave." But it was the last whisper that froze them in their tracks. The forest never forgets. The ground gave way beneath Ethan's feet. He fell, his body sinking into the earth, his scream caught in his throat. Tyler reached down, trying to pull him up, but the roots grabbed at Ethan, pulling him deeper into the earth, into the dark, ancient depths of the forest. His hand slipped away, and the last thing Tyler saw was Ethan's eyes, wide, panicked, pleading, before they vanished into the soil. Mia screamed, but Tyler could barely hear it. He was already running, faster than he ever had before. The bones of the tree rattled in the distance, and the whispers never stopped. Not even when they made it back to their camp, breathless and wild-eyed, desperately trying to convince themselves it was over. But they knew deep down that they would never be free. The forest had marked them, and it would never forget. Story 10. The echoes of campfire stories. The fire flickered in the darkness, casting a warm, golden glow that seemed to soften the edges of the surrounding forest. The tall trees, their branches swaying gently in the night breeze, stood like silent sentinels around the small clearing. The stars above, dimmed by the canopy, shone faintly through the gaps in the leaves, but it was the fire's dance that held their attention. 6 friends sat around it, their faces illuminated by the orange light. They were laughing, telling stories, sharing the kind of secrets only whispered in the dark. It was supposed to be just another weekend trip, backpacking, camping, and maybe a few ghost stories. But something about this night felt off. Something in the air had changed, though none of them could put their finger on it. "All right, my turn," said Ryan, the self-proclaimed king of campfire tales. His eyes sparkled with mischief as he leaned forward, stoking the fire with a stick. "This one's a classic, but trust me, it's real." He paused for effect, letting the sound of crackling would fill the air before he began. "They say, deep in these woods, there's a place where the trees grow so close together that they block out the sun. No birds sing, no animals move. It's just silent, empty except for the whispers." The others leaned in, their faces reflecting a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Ryan's voice dropped to a hushed whisper as he continued. "They say if you stand in that place long enough, the whispers start to sound like your own name. And the longer you listen, the more real it becomes. And eventually, it calls you, and you can never escape." A shiver ran through the group. A gust of wind passed through the trees, sending the fire crackling higher, casting weird, long shadows. "Stop it, Ryan," said Emily, trying to shake off the unease creeping up her spine. "You're freaking me out." But Ryan just grinned, clearly enjoying the tension. "You think I'm joking?" Some people say they've heard the whispers, even at night, even when they're alone. And when they followed the sound, they found nothing, just empty woods. But they were never the same again. Something changed inside them. The fire crackled loudly, and for a moment, there was silence. The wind had stopped. Then, from the woods beyond the firelight, came a sound. At first, it was subtle, just a faint rustling of leaves, a twig snapping, but it was so precise, so deliberate. The sound came closer, then stopped. Another rustle, another step. "Did you hear that?" Chris asked, his voice a little too high, a little too shaky. Everyone fell quiet. The rustling was unmistakable now. Someone was moving just outside their circle of light. "It's probably just a deer," Emily said, trying to dismiss the unease in her voice. But her eyes darted to the shadows at the edge of the clearing. "I don't think that's a deer," Matt murmured. He stood, grabbing a flashlight from his backpack and shining it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing. They all waited, holding their breath. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the sound stopped. The forest seemed to hold its breath, too. A cold silence fell over the group, heavier than it had been moments before. "I think we should go inside the tent," Emily said, suddenly not so eager to sit around the fire. But Ryan only chuckled. "Scared already? Come on, you guys. It's just a sound. Nothing to worry about." He grabbed another log and tossed it into the fire. The crackling intensified, the flames rising higher. But with them came another sound. This time, it was unmistakable. Whispers, soft and indistinct, curling around their ears. At first, they couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. It was the same hushed murmur that Ryan had described. Then it came again, louder this time, repeating the same phrase over and over. "Ryan," Emily whispered, eyes wide. "I think it's your story." Ryan froze, his face paling. "No way, no way." But then, as if to confirm their worst fears, the whispers grew clearer. They weren't just random murmurs. They were names. Their names. Emily, Matt, Chris, Ryan. The air grew colder. The fire flickered and dimmed, as if something was feeding off its light. Then, from the shadows of the trees, something else moved, a shape dark and indistinct that seemed to shift and writhe. "Turn off the lights," Ryan shouted, standing up so quickly that his chair toppled over. His flashlight swung wildly, illuminating nothing but trees. "Get inside the tent now." But it was too late. The moment they tried to stand, the ground beneath them seemed to tremble. The trees creaked and groaned, their branches reaching out like long fingers, twisting toward them. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices now, all speaking in unison. "Join us, join us." The wind picked up, sending a chill down their spines as the whispers turned into a low, guttural growl. Something in the trees was watching them, something old, something hungry. The shadows at the edge of the clearing seemed to grow longer, darker, like they were alive, moving, stalking them with malice. They didn't run. They couldn't. The shadows seemed to swallow them, pulling them back toward the fire, toward the woods where the whispers now began to call their names louder, clearer. until they could hear nothing else. And just like that, their stories, their very lives became part of the forest. The fire was still crackling when the searchers arrived, hours later, finding only the remnants of a campfire and empty, abandoned tents. They never found the friends, or what had become of them. But some nights, in the quiet of the woods, when the wind picks up just right, the whispers can still be heard. And if you listen carefully enough, you might just hear your own name. The forest, it seems, is always listening,